How is it possible that a woman and 2 kids are just completely gone off the face of the earth?
I promise you, I have nothing on my hands. I did nothing to those kids or her to make them vanish.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. We've spent quite a lot of time looking at slips, verbal slips that Chris Watts has made. And in this episode we're going to look at something else, which is something that is role-played while he's speaking, but it's also kind of a slip in terms of body language, and it's something I've certainly missed, something I saw for the first time quite recently, and I want to draw to your attention. I'm also going to play a trick on you. I won't go as far as calling it a kind of hypnosis, but I'm going to put an idea in your brain, and I'm going to let you know that I'm doing that as well, and then I'm going to play the clips again with the footage, knowing what we know. Now, although it seems like it's a trick and it seems like it's maybe even mind manipulation or something like that, what we're really doing is we just educating ourselves or re-educating ourselves about the facts of the case as we know them. And the facts of the case are, first of all, that we know that Chris Watts murdered his family. Number 2, we know that he used his hands to murder his family. And number 3, we also know how he made his family vanish, right? So those are 3 basic aspects that we all know. Now, if you look at the question Coder asks him, it's a fantastic question. So it's a general open-ended question. He doesn't ask, what did you do to Shanann? Or, you must have done something to your children or something like that. He doesn't mention any names. He keeps it very, very general. Right? He asks, how is it possible that a woman and her 2 kids are just completely gone? And those first couple of words there, how is it possible, are fantastic, because he's basically saying there's no explanation. You need to provide me with a couple of possibilities, right? How is it possible that someone just disappears with 2 children? And when he refers to off the face of the earth, he's sort of emphasizing the craziness of it. It's colorful language suggesting the craziness of, how could 3 human beings literally, one minute they're walking the earth and the next they're gone. It's just not possible. And he's putting that idea, as I say, sketched in a very general way, on Watts's plate. He's sort of laying that card on the table and saying, okay, well, now you must play your hand. And knowing what we know, it's fascinating to look at Watts's response, also knowing what he knows, and we know what he knows as well. And so how he responds is he refers to his hands. He says, I promise you, and he refers to having nothing on his hands. Now, if you take that whole idea literally, and you might say, well, you're overthinking it or whatever. Well, let's overthink it. Let's see what happens when we do overthink it. And then you say, okay, we know that Chris Watts used his hands to manually attack and strangle Shanann, right? We also know that he used his hands to open the thief hatch and to push his little girls, unfortunately, through those narrow openings. We also know that he used his hands to dig the hole near the well site. We know he used his hands to push Shanann into it, and then also he used his hands to rake the dust over the grave. And those are kind of all fairly general ways that he used his hands. But think about what he's actually saying there. He's saying, I have nothing on my hands. Now you might say, it doesn't really matter. It's saying the same thing. He didn't use his hands to do anything. He's not guilty of something. But think of it in a more literal way. If we take the whole thing further and you say, and it's something I'm going to be talking about in a follow-up episode in terms of the autopsy. I've just had a little bit of pushback from people that say, when I suggest that Shanann wasn't only strangled but also used a rag soaked in ethanol or alcohol or some substance that would have sped up her losing consciousness, they say that is a complete invention and it's not based on the autopsy. And I'm going to challenge that, and I'm going to talk about that in the episode following this one. For those who dispute that, for those who disagree, just suspend your disbelief for a moment on that particular point. Now let's imagine that Chris Watts did not just use his hands, but actually did use some rag or something. And I'll explain why I believe that in the next episode. Then Watts would have something on his hands. Another thing is, if he used those blue nitrile gloves, he would have literally had something covering his hands. He would have had something on his hands. So that's the first sort of layer just to address. We should also bear in mind that Watts seems to have committed a very cleaned up crime, certainly in terms of 2825 Saratoga Trail. There were no odors, there were no signs of a struggle, there was nothing obvious except for what appeared to be either mascara or excrement on the pillow covers that were thrown into the trash, right? Besides that, there was virtually no sign of obvious sign of a struggle or of something happening. The other aspect then is, if you go to the well site, and we know you went to the well site, is you're dealing with oily, dirty, chemically laced tanks, and in other words, you're dealing with chemicals or a scenario where there are chemicals. And so if Chris Watts went to the well site and he opened the thief hatch, probably he was wearing gloves again. But to try and sort of manipulate his children through the thief hatch, one can imagine, and it's something I wrote about very, very early on, that I thought some kind of processing or preparation had to have been necessary in order to facilitate this process, especially if it was premeditated. And so there is some sign, this is speculation, certainly not absolute, but there's some sign that he may have smeared Vaseline on them, just because that's something that he spoke about in the bathroom. As I said, that's complete speculation, but it's possible that that's something he did. Obviously, once the bodies were in suspension in the oil, that Vaseline would, because it's a similar compound to the oil, it wouldn't come up. So, because it's petroleum jelly, essentially. So that's something else that he could have literally had on his hands, right? Then the third aspect is, if he was literally handling the bodies of his wife and children, and we know that he was, you would have the odor of that on his hands. You would have the excrement that he would literally have to pick up on his hands. So if Chris Watts committed this crime, and there's no doubt that he did, you can kind of imagine when he thinks about it, when he's asked, what happened to them, what is passing involuntarily through his subconscious and some of it filtering through to his consciousness, is the various ways that he had all of this on his hands, whether it was grains of sand, whether it was drops of oil, whether it was brown excrement, whether it was mascara, whether it was nitrile gloves, whether it was oil or Vaseline or whatever it was. He certainly had all of that on his hands. And so that is what I want you to take into this question when you listen to it. And we're going to listen to it 3 times, once using the video, once just referring to images, and then once zoomed in, looking to the images. And what I want you to do is turn the switch on of your imagination and see how we can see through these hand movements, which are, he's using them in sympathy to what he actually did, and just how accurate something like true crime rocket science can be, how body language can tell us and reveal far more than we realize just through these incidental role-playing moments. Okay, are you ready? As I say, turn on your imagination, go into that place in your mind, and here we go.
How is it possible that a woman and two kids are just completely gone off the face of the earth?
I promise you, I have nothing on my hands I did nothing to those kids or her to make them vanish.
How is it possible that a woman and two kids are just completely gone off the face of the earth?
I promise you, I have nothing on my hands I did nothing to those kids or her to make them vanish.
So we played it back twice now. We're going to play it one more time, but before we get to that, I'm going to zoom in even more on the third time. Just look at the way Chris Watts is holding his hand. He's holding his hand splayed open and holding it up to himself, right? He's not holding his hand as if he's sort of putting it on someone with his fingers directed away from himself. And I've emphasized this before, where when the agents ask him to kind of role play and gesture, they gesture with their own hands in that way. In other words, the fingers focused away from himself, the fingers pointing downwards as if he's facing his victim. And Watts then took his cue from them, as he's done all along. That's how he's sort of come up with the first, second, and third confessions. He's sort of taken his cue from others. But when you see Watts here, when he says, well, how is it possible? You see him holding his hand open to himself, and then with his hand still open, pushing it to the side, right? And when you look at the image I've depicted there of someone putting their hand in a thief hatch, just look at the way that their hand is there. It's the same kind of thing. It's disposing of someone. You also can see things on that hand, right? And what's more than likely is when Watts committed this crime, there was a moment when he did look at his hands, when he did look, what did he have on his hands, whether it was dust, whether it was saliva, whether it was mascara, whether it was lipstick, whether it was oil or excrement. He looked at his hands and then he washed his hands. He probably washed his hands quite a few times. He also looked at his own hand closing the thief hatch. If he opened the thief hatch, which is below him, he also had to, once the bodies were inside the tanks, he would then have to close the hatch. Hence that sort of motion to away. And he's giving all of that away just through his body language.
How is it possible that a woman and two kids are just completely gone off the face of the earth?
I promise you, I have nothing on my hands I did nothing to those kids or her to make them vanish.
I'm not going to take it any further than that. I'm going to, as I said earlier, I'm going to be putting up an episode on Shanann Watts' autopsy report versus the scenario in Chris Watts' Confessions of the Killer. Someone actually, as I said, took me to task on this, that saying that I invent scenarios that aren't based on the discovery. They clearly haven't read any of the books that I've written. All of it is absolutely anchored in either the media narrative or in statements that these people make, or in images, or in the discovery, and often and typically in all of these, not just one or the other. So I'm trying to come up with the most likely scenario that makes sense and incorporates all the evidence. And we do have a problem. The Lifetime movie illustrates it very well. We do have a problem with the fact that Shanann has no defensive wounds, and how do we explain that? And True Crime Rocket Science came up with an explanation right in the beginning, in September, when I published my first book on this case. I need an explanation for why there was no screaming, why no witnesses heard screaming, why there were no defensive wounds, and also how Watts, given his temperament, how he would have approached this if it was a premeditated crime. And I refer to some interesting information in this episode in terms of lung damage. I'm also going to refer to John Benet Ramsey's autopsy, and I think you'll find that certainly quite interesting. If you're interested in this kind of analysis, please subscribe to the channel. It's also important that you share across your social networks, especially Facebook and true crime forums on Facebook. If you're interested in listening to the audiobooks that I've put up, you can head to Patreon. There are already 2 books, basically one book on John Benet Ramsey, another in progress with about 8 or 9 chapters already loaded on Silver Fox, and I'm planning on adding quite a few more into the Patreon channel. I've also just uploaded the remaining points in the 13 Things Right in the Lifetime movie, points 8 to 13. That's actually a really interesting episode, but it's certainly a bit of more of a darker analysis than the first 7 points that I raised here. So if you're interested in that, head on to Patreon. I think that particular episode's under the $2 tier. Thank you for listening, and I will see you guys next time.